This build began almost 6 years ago. It had a nice case and was fairly small. But, as promising as it seemed, deal-breaking issues in its design forced this project into a long-term hiatus. Lately, a small contest on bitbuild.net breathed new life into this project. The goal was to pick up an old, abandoned build and bring it back to life within a month. This was rushed for the deadline and was sadly completed a few days after. The video was then pushed back a lot to favor other projects. This is going to be a trip in the past in terms of modding. Most things are outdated and shouldn't be taken as advice, especially the spaghetti wiring. Just like in the previous video, you'll find timecodes in the description. The build was close to being done. The case was made with vacuum forming. 3D printers weren't used much for these builds at the time. If you're not familiar with portables, this build contains a trimmed GameCube, a memory card hardwired to it, a Wiikey Fusion wired instead of the disk drive, a screen and its controller circuit, and finally a controller board cut apart. At the time, this portable had been planned out with care. It was supposed to be Zelda-themed, as shows the carefully hand-cut fan holes. A little 2D animation was even planned out for the release video, with Toon Link slashing at a few enemies and finding the system in a treasure chest. This alone took quite some time and dedication. It would have made for a corny but flashy intro. Let's go over the big issues this build had and find out how to work around them. This video will show you the many problems that can arise when finishing a portable. First, the whole design, while promising at first, was kind of ruined. The yellow paint accents and clear coat ruined the aesthetic. This we can't really fix without sanding and painting the whole thing again. We'll just have to live with it. Secondly, one of the biggest reasons, the cooling solution. Here's the problem. Due to lack of experience, the heatsink was planned in a way that won't satisfyingly cool the system. The case has been cut for this cooling solution. We can't change it too much. The fan was supposed to push out the hot air away from the heatsink, but it clearly won't work as such. Instead, we could try having the fan intake from the big opening blow through the heatsink above the GPU and hopefully have it exit through the front. The heatsink was modified to account for that. The fan is glued down. Tape is added to optimize the airflow. This is pretty bad, but it seems to work. We can start to forget the idea of an internal battery. It may get hot in there. Thirdly, back then, close to completion, the audio amplifier circuit gave out. This seems like a small issue, but actually, the case was built with it in mind. The amplifier must be fairly small and have tactile switches for volume control. Thankfully, nowadays, the BitBuild community keeps track of helpful parts. Amongst them is this amp. It's perfect for our needs. After the usual testing, we can wire it up and extend the buttons to the pre-made cutouts in the case. The audio amp will be paired with 2 replacement 3DS XL speakers. They sound remarkably good given their size. However, the amp wouldn't work at first. Thankfully, within minutes of crying for help on BitBuild, Aurelio, an esteemed member, solved the issue. 2 pins had to be bridged. You should go have a look at his channel. There's cool stuff on there, and much more to come. The fourth problem is the sum of the bad design choices that made this portable less and less interesting. 3DS sliders are pretty good, but they don't come close to an actual joystick. The shoulder buttons are just B buttons painted in yellow. They turned out to be too small and poorly placed. The worst one of all is the 4-way tactile switch used instead of the D-pad. It's impossible to use reliably in games. Then again, for these issues, there's not much to do but to accept them. The remaining issues were the nails that ended up sealing the coffin. Right when this build seemed somewhat done, the memory card started glitching out. Then, the Wiikey Fusion started working only 1 time out of 10. The memory card is hardwired to the vias of the CPU. It's difficult to start again. As it turns out, years later, the connections are still solid and the card still works. The issue was that data randomly disappeared. This doesn't seem to happen anymore, except whenever booting F-Zero GX. It somehow corrupts the memory card and deletes everything. It's systematic and really weird. If someone in the comments can explain this, please do. For now, this system just won't play this particular game, just to be safe. The Wiikey issue was very weird also. The wiring seemed solid even if it's very messy. After a lot of searching and fiddling, it turns out it's just a matter of connecting the flat cable a little bit less far in the socket. It could still be the wiring, but in this position, it works 100% of the time. This goes to show how fiddly the Wiikey on a GameCube can be. Nowadays, there are better solutions, cheaper and more reliable, which is why GameCube portables are outdated, but more on that later. Now that all these issues are sorted out in a way, let's assemble the portable quickly. Assembly is a big step. It takes longer than you'd think, especially if you haven't planned out things properly, like here. Many issues arose because of going too fast. First, when putting the whole assembly into the back part of the case, one wire was completely overlooked. It had been glued in an unsafe way. It completely damaged the component attached to it. Sadly, it was Player 1 data. The destroyed component was very important. This could have been a premature end for this revival. But luckily, a similar component was extracted from another board and soldered in its place. This component is really tiny, but in a stroke of luck, the replacement worked. Seems like this build wants to be revived in the end. The Z button had never been integrated into the case. Its hole had to be drilled. This is risky since you don't want to scratch the finished case. The motherboard is screwed in the back of the case. This is the only proper mounting mechanism you'll find in there. Instead of properly mounting the rest of the components, the rest will be brutally glued to save time. This is terrible, but if this project is to happen, it's only going to happen this way. This wiring will remain as is. Soon, there won't be enough space for the battery, even though there are large gaps of dead space scattered around. This is a good example of why you shouldn't do this. Now, we have to deal with this mess of wires. The power switch, the memory card, the Wiikey Fusion, and the SD card reader are glued to the motherboard. The black button is for the Wiikey. It simulates the eject button, which triggers the Wiikey Fusion. The power button is strongly glued to the case. This controller port was very useful for testing. Now it can also be used for a second player. The front of the case is assembled as fast as possible. The screen is glued and epoxied. Its driver board also. The screen has 3 tact switches to adjust the image. The buttons are all placed and epoxied, and the 3DS sliders are strongly bonded to the case. And as always, let's test all this. The chip on the controller board is put on a makeshift plastic bridge. At this point, the concept of saving space is thrown out the window. As for the triggers, they're on the back half of the unit. Each side has 2 switches. One does a press on the analog data line, the other is the click at the end of the GameCube controller. For example, having these 2 discrete switches allows us to still be able to run around while spraying in Mario Sunshine when the trigger is lightly pressed. The wires have to reach the other half of the unit, so let's make them a bit long so we can fold everything. These are the last things to connect. And then, after some more testing, we're ready to close the unit. After a long wait, this portable rises from the grave. It's as plain as can be, but it is alive. This whole thing was just about finding a use to this pile of parts catching dust, more so than it was about making a good system. The thermals seem satisfying. It gets hot, but not enough to worry. And there's a spot for an exhaust fan on the bottom. For now, there isn't a battery inside anyways. This isn't a real portable because of that. The battery pack may have fit if the assembly had been properly done, but this unit was crudely slapped together. A good solution would be to make an external battery pack that fits at the back. The system is already pretty thick, but it'd still be easy to hold. Maybe next time. It does feel good to finish a system and cross it off the list. For all its flaws, this system still feels pretty good to play. It has a few things going its way. The hand position isn't too cramped, and the very rounded corners actually feel good in the hand. Let's take a second to talk about this channel. A few people are still asking for a follow-up to the GameCube portable build. You have to realize all the footage uploaded till now had all been filmed in one sitting 4 years ago as a potential featured series. Since it failed, the footage was then stitched into the episodes you may have seen. GameCube portables are now very outdated. This video will at least be useful in showing you guys why it's not a very good idea to build a GameCube portable these days. There are many expensive parts needed. Most of all, the mod chip is difficult to solder and now almost impossible to find. Nowadays, Wiis can do all the things a GameCube can, without a mod chip nor a memory card, while being cheaper and smaller. It would be bad advice to keep showing how to make a GameCube portable when they are becoming impractical. Also, these videos were never tutorials. Just note that, as detailed as the videos can become, they will always be build logs and not tutorials. For that, turn to the BitBuild forums. In the end, let's appreciate this console for what it is and move on. It's quite underwhelming, but it's satisfying to have finished it, and it's fun to play. Thanks for watching, and be sure to subscribe to not miss future videos.